All right, this is the second part of 12.2, and we're going to start with a few definitions. One is what we call the modal class, okay? So remember a class 0 to 4, 5 to 9, those things that we looked at, that the modal class is going to be the one that occurs the most. Just like when we get to central tendencies, measures of central tendencies, we'll talk about the mode being the one that occurs the most. So we can also find a midpoint of a class, which is called the class mark, and that's by taking the upper and lower class limits, adding them together, and then dividing by 2, which means that we're averaging them, okay? So we're actually going to look at this problem here. We're going to look at these number of values that we talked about on that first page, and we're going to make both a histogram and a frequency polygon. But going back to the class, the midpoint of a class or the class mark, I'm going to look at the example from the other page. So on the other page, just write example. If I was to find the class mark between 31.5 and 37.6, I would add those two together and divide by 2. And so the class mark would be 34.55. So that's just sometimes another way to put our data having that middle point rather than having the end and the beginning of the class, okay? So now we're going to do, and the histograms and the frequency polygons in your My Math Lab are going to be multiple choice, but we're going to actually draw these by hand just so that you guys can get a feel of how they are created, okay? So we will have histograms is a bar graph where the bars touch, okay? And so we're always going to have on the horizontal axis, which is this one, okay, horizontal going left to right, we will have the observed values. And on the vertical axis, going up and down, we will have the frequencies, okay? So as I look at this, your graphs will always be labeled, but I'm going to make a really big graph here. So I'm going to make a vertical line there, and I'm going to make my horizontal line here. And so we will have, I'm going to label this because it's always good to label it. We will say number of families, because that's going to be my frequencies. And then down here, we're going to have number of children. And so I'm going to actually start. Now, we don't have to start with the 0 in the corner. We can, but usually the point that we're talking about making our bar graph, that point is actually going to be in the middle of my bar. So I'm going to have 0 here, and then I'm going to count all the way to 9 because that's how many we had, and try to make them as even as possible. I know we're doing this by hand, but that's what we're looking for. Let me go here, extend this just a little bit. All right, and then we see our frequencies. Our frequencies go from 1 all the way up to 18. So I'm going to count by 5s. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, and we'll stop at 20, okay? Then I'm going to draw my bars, and my bars are going to have that center point in the middle of the bar. So for 0, there were 8 families that had 0 children, so we're going to make a bar that looks like that. And then we're going to build off of that bar. So one child, there was 11 families. So we're just going to extend it up here. And then there were 18 families that had 2. And then there were 11 that had 3. And there were 6 that had 4. And there were 4 that had 5. And so my bars are getting a little bit bigger. And then we had 2 that had 6. We had 1 that had 7. We had 2 that had 8. And then we had 1 that had 9. All right, so roughly we have that bar graph. Okay, and so a frequency polygon is just a line graph, okay? So I'm going to put that under here, and I'm actually going to make my frequency polygon on top of my histogram. So this is just a line graph. And so I would put a dot at the center of each of these bars. And then I would connect them. And so that's what it looks like for the frequency polygon, okay? So now what we're going to do is we're going to determine the total number of observations. They're going to give you this, and they're going to also have some information that you might have to fill in. But we're going to look at the frequency table here, and we're going to be able to answer these questions, okay? So determine the total number of observations we have to do, we have to add up our total frequencies, okay? So for A, so that's 10, 20, 22, and 9, that would be 31, okay? So the total number of observations is 31, okay? Determine the width of each class, okay? So remember, choose any upper or lower limit and then subtract the number above it. So I'm going to choose 33. That's the upper limit of the second class. I'm going to subtract 22, and that tells me that the width is 11. If you take 12 and subtract it from 22, you're going to get your class limit as 10, and that's a very common error. A lot of people just subtract the two numbers from the limits, but they're not including the one that they're starting at, okay? Then it says, part C, determine the midpoint of the second class. So I'm going to highlight this right here is my second class, okay? So the midpoint is 33 plus 23, which is 56, and then divide it by 2, which is 28. Okay. All right, then it says determine the modal class or classes. So remember, the modal class is the one that has the highest frequency. So our modal class would be this one right here, 12 to 22. Okay, and then determine the class limit of the next class if it was added. Okay, so it ends, the last class ends on 77, so that means that it would start at 78, and then we know we would add 11 to 77, and it would end at 88. Okay? So that finishes up histograms and frequency polygons. And now we're going to go into stem and leaf displays, but I'm going to leave that for another video.